We are pleased to be speaking now with Mr. Tim Callen, visiting fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and formerly IMF mission chief to Saudi Arabia. Tim was also head of the GCC division at the IMF from 2012 to 2021. Tim's work and recent writing focuses on the economics of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region, and his latest for the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington blog discusses how increased spending in Saudi Arabia raises risks to the Saudi budget. Excited to get into that and much more. Tim, welcome to the 966.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here and looking forward to our discussion.
Hi, Tim. You've, as we were laughing about this morning, as you can see from my spectral down in the basement, video, we had some technical difficulties this morning. Appreciate your patience, but more importantly, we are really excited to have you on. First of all, I think we need to give a shout out to the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. You are a scholar there. They have a tremendous lineup of analysts, scholars, experts. And we draw from them often for the 966. Delighted that you are now affiliated with them, Tim. And because I want to riff a little bit on what Lucian said on his intro, you've had extraordinary access to finances and economics as as IMF's mission chief for Saudi Arabia for close to a decade, and then you essentially led the IMF's research program on the GCC region. So the nature of IMF is you have full and complete access. Really, is this correct?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we at the IMF would be there writing our annual, health check of the Saudi economy, meeting with, senior economic leaders in Saudi Arabia, but also, more than that, having an ongoing relationship throughout the year via other visits, research reports, attending conferences. Clearly, the main focus of the IMF is, usually with the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. And I think that was clearly the case also in Saudi Arabia. But of course, under Vision 2030, the reforms are going way beyond the, fiscal, monetary, financial areas. So it was important that we, meet other ministries, senior officials in, economy, housing, tourism, energy, and so on. And of course, meet the private sector, businesses, banks, business councils, and so on to get a broad picture. So, yeah, I think, it's fair to say we have very good access to the Saudi policy making framework at the IMF. Of course, I have to talk now in the past tense, not in the present tense, because I'm no longer with the IMF. But that gives you a sense, I think, of how things, I'm sure still are for the current mission team as well.
Well, and we want to draw on all that expertise and background. The sort of the initiating factor in our reaching out to you, and we really appreciate you coming on, was you wrote an very interesting article in the Arab Gulf States Institute's publications entitled "A Smaller Saudi Population Puts Key Economic Indicators in a More Favorable Light." And this, for our listeners, Saudi Arabia completed last year its latest census, and it's only had 5. It's had a census since 1974, 1992, 2004, 2010, and now in 2022. This is a big deal for any country, but I felt, and I think Lucian probably agrees, it sort of went by with not as much focus as it needed. And so I was really struck when you wrote this article. And what I'd like to do, if we can, is let's start with that, your findings, what's your sense, and we can move on, because I know I don't want to limit your economic and analytical expertise, because you've written also on economic diversification, as Lucian mentioned, written on the risk of spending rises. But let's talk with the census. What was your take? Why were you motivated to write this article?
Yeah, I mean, so I started at the Arab Gulf States Institute at the beginning of July. And one of the first things I noticed was the census that we'd been waiting for. At least part of the census had been published by the Statistics Authority, and I thought it was very interesting because that, as you said, there hadn't been or wasn't a lot of coverage of the census, and what there was tended to be quite negative in the association of a smaller population. I think is associated with probably less political power, less influence, and I think, well, from an economic point of view, it's of course not all bad actually to have a smaller population, in the sense that one, you're going to have less pressure on infrastructure. You'll need less housing, less roads, etc. if your population is lower, than you otherwise would. But it also makes some economic indicators actually better. So anything that's per capita terms that we're dividing by the population is going to look better. So GDP per capita will have increased. And there are also, I think, implications, although at the moment, because not all of the census data has been published, we don't know. So particularly, I think the labour market module, which is still to come, is going to be super interesting. But a smaller population, and I think it's important here to say that most of the reduction in the estimated population comes from Saudi nationals rather than from the expatriate population. But it could well have implications in terms of the level of productivity in the Saudi economy. So if we find out there's actually less employment than previously estimated, which seems a possibility given the lower population numbers, it would mean output per worker is higher. Or another thing that could happen is that labour force participation rates may be higher. If that's the case, I think particularly given Vision 2030 has a very clear desire to increase female labour force participation rates, which it's achieved, but it's possible actually those participation rates could be higher than are currently measured. None of this we can be certain about until the remaining modules of the census are published, but I think it's a possibility. And I think maybe one last point before I stop on this is it's also important to recognize that while the estimated population is lower now than had previously been estimated, it still means the population is growing. We've still seen population growth over the last decade, and I've seen some press coverage saying, the population has declined. That's not true in absolute terms. It's declined relative to earlier, or it's lower than earlier estimates made it out to be.
So, and let's speak to that, because the census found there were 32.2 million Saudis, or the population was 32.2 million. I think that's, going into it was somewhere around 34 million, that it would come in around 34 million. So it's a slight, slightly less than anticipated. It's still, over 2010, a 34, plus 34% increase, or over 8 million. Saudis make up 58, just over 58% of that, correct? 18.8 million. And with regard to the census, and I think it's interesting because it's something maybe we can revisit, the census has sort of released detailed data on three categories: population, households, and housing. Yet to come, and I had anticipated that would be here by the end of the year, are detailed data on education, health, employment, income, migration, and diversity, all of which would be very important to understand and see what the trend lines are.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, all of those areas are particularly important, and maybe let's focus on a couple. I mean, clearly, one is education, as you say, which I think is a central plank of efforts to diversify and grow the Saudi economy in the future, is going to be making sure that the education system from all the way through from primary school, or even improving pre-K all the way through PhD level, making sure that Saudi nationals and others who study in the country have the education and skills that's going to be needed in the sort of type of labor market and economy that Saudi's trying to develop under Vision 2030. So having a good baseline through the census on where we stand with education, I think is going to be very important. And then secondly, in the labor market, again, I think there is so much focus on labor market issues in Saudi, and rightly so. There's a big transformation going on in terms of more women coming into the workforce, more Saudis working in the private sector, or certainly the non-government sector, than in the past. And I think, again, having accurate information that the census should be able to provide us on these areas is super important to provide an accurate baseline for policymakers to use going forward. As I said, I think that the modules that have been released imply there are going to be important changes in the labour market data, which of course then will filter into the quarterly labour market statistics that GA-Stat publish. But I'm very much interested and looking forward to seeing this new data when it's released.
Yes. Based on what's released, what, in your opinion, what's the most important or the most notable data point coming out of this census for you? And I want to move, let's move on into your discussion of economic diversification, how it's going. But from this census, what do you think? What's the most meaningful takeaway?
Well, I think clearly the headline and probably the most meaningful is the lower population estimate, in that I think it does have implications across how we interpret a number of economic series. I think it still is unfortunate that there isn't a better explanation coming out from the statistical authorities on why the population estimates have been revised down. And to me, it was certainly surprising that most of the downward revision was in the Saudi population, because I'd always thought it was likely much harder to measure accurately the expatriate population than the Saudi population. So I think having a better understanding of what the factors were behind the estimate is going to be important. But I think as it stands, the lower population is is probably the key thing, because it has implications not only for how we interpret current economic outcomes, but it also is going to have important implications looking forward, because if you have a lower population, again, 5 years, then 10 years in the future than you thought you were going to have, that is going to have implications for how you build out your infrastructure, what you're going to need in terms of if it's going to affect the how the number of children going through school age and so on, how you need to plan your education, health, all of these sorts of things. So I think that's really key. Maybe one other thing that's worth mentioning here as well is the publication of data on the nationality of the expatriate population, which I think is something many people have been interested in seeing for a number of years, and it's always been a bit of a guesstimate as to where the where the relative standings of foreign workers from different countries are. Now we have a baseline on that as well from this census, which I think is important to help understanding as well.
Yes, there is sort of an accepted understanding that X nationality is the largest expatriate community, but it will be interesting to get real numbers on all this. Just for our listeners, the census found that the median age, Saudi Arabia's population median age, is 29, and as often discussed, it's a young population with over 63% of Saudis under the age of 30. So again, that's a sort of a common theme, how young the population is. Let's talk about another article you wrote for Arab Gulf states, and that was on economic diversification. How it's going? Does this tie in at all with that? And then we can
Yeah,
move into what your findings were on
yeah.
that article.
Well, I mean, I think it does, right, clearly, because sort of the size of your population and then the additional, information we're going to find out about, sort of the current standing of the labor market, education system and education levels is all going to be really important in terms of how, diversification and indeed the need for diversification going forward. I mean, going back to your point about how young the Saudi population is, we're still, I think, at the early stages of the population coming into the workforce. Of course, we see, a number of young people coming in, but there's still a lot of people in school who are going to be coming into the labor force in the coming years. And of course, for them, getting jobs and interesting, well-paid jobs is going to be hugely important to them. And what's that going to require? Well, it's going to require strong growth in the private sector, a move up the value chain, I think, of Saudi production, and that's all part of diversification. So I mean, I think the link between the need to diversify to create jobs and the young structure of the Saudi population is probably one of the key drivers of the ambitious reforms under Vision 2030, that recognition that all of these people can't be employed in the government sector. The economy needs to be diversified if these people are going to be economically satisfied going forward. So I see it as a close link between the two.
Well, and apropos of that, one of the data points that still has to come out is education, which is so fundamental to their efforts to diversify.
Yeah.
Where are young Saudis being? What skills are they learning, and will they translate into a diversifying economy?
I think that's exactly right. If we look on one side, and I think very positively, a lot of young Saudis going to university. I mean, it's interesting. I think that we see more women or young women going to university than young men in Saudi Arabia. We've also seen the overseas scholarship program that was implemented, which has pushed a lot of Saudis through schools in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. But I think what we see at a broader level is, probably wages on average in Saudi being higher than productivity levels. And we did some work, maybe 4 or 5 years ago at the IMF that looked at this. And if you look on a, sort of cross-country basis at the relationship between productivity and wage levels, Saudi and indeed, most of the other GCC countries stand out as having wages which are too high relative to productivity levels, whereas countries like China are often the other way around. So in terms of becoming internationally competitive, it's going to be really important that productivity levels in Saudi go up. It's very hard to see wages in nominal terms coming down. So productivity is going to have to be boosted to make this desire of having Saudi as a competitive base for an industrial sector. If that's going to come true, productivity levels are going to have to go up to make it to make that possible.
Interesting. And you said, as you noted, you stepped out of the IMF situation in 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct, out of the staff. And then I worked in the Saudi executive director's office at the IMF for a year as an advisor.
All right, so you're up through last year. I mean, with regard to productivity, it's always the question. Have you seen any trend lines? And did you see any trend lines?
I mean, I think in terms of sort of productivity from economic data, last time I looked at it, it's still hard to see any change. But of course, it's something that takes a while. There's a lot of volatility year to year. We've been through COVID, which has really messed up, I think, longer term economic analysis for a couple of years. But what I will say is, as you said at the beginning, I worked on Saudi starting in 2012, finishing as the mission chief in 2021. And the quality of the staff that we interacted with across the different ministries and other government entities really improved significantly over that length of stay as the mission chief. I think the last 3 or 4 years, really impressive young people, men and women, we were interacting with, very dynamic, very hardworking. So if that, personal interaction is any indication of where the economic measurement of productivity is going, I think it will be on an upward trend. Just at least from what I've seen, I haven't seen it yet.
It is fascinating, and that these things you can't see unless except over a period of time. Anecdotally, it's that your point is very interesting, because it seems to me, and Lucian, you can speak to this perhaps, it just seems to me that, since the launch of Vision 2030, the focus on best practices, the focus on more professional, accountable workplace has, and again, anecdotally, has resulted in just what you just said. It seems to a notable and significant upgrade in terms of capabilities, attention to detail, focus on the job, any number of things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's certainly my experience. And, I think as well, the first couple of years I was, traveling to Saudi, having meetings, it would be incredibly hard to get a meeting after 2:30 in the afternoon in the government. Right now, many of the government seem to be, I mean, it's an exaggeration to say they're working 24/7, because that's clearly impossible. But they're working much longer hours. Expectations for delivery are much more focused on timeline. Quality of the work is much better. And I think just the expectations of what is expected in the government, and then clearly elsewhere as well, have changed. And I think also the younger people are probably, many of them are more career focused maybe than other generations were, and I think that's delivering in the sense of they have a work ethic, they have career ambitions, and they know and want to deliver good work that gets the recognition and moves them forward in their careers.
And it seems to start at the top. I mean, the Crown Prince is sort of famous for his work ethic. And I have had more than one leading business person say to me, there used to be a time where we couldn't get ministers to pay attention or to respond or to be timely in any of their engagements. And now we have to race to keep up.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in a sense, if one, concern, comes out of all of the reform efforts, it's maybe that, things are moving so quickly and on such short deadlines that, it may be hard to, do a full analysis of everything that's trying to be done, and whether then, programs in one area of the government may overlap, or in some cases even contradict programs in other parts of the government. I think it's certainly true that a broader, overall governance structure has been put on the economic reforms with the, creation of the Council for Economic and Development Affairs, CEDA. I think I've got the name correct, which I think is, being successful in terms of, trying to get everybody on the same page for the reforms. But I do feel sometimes that things are moving so quickly that it can be hard to, to keep up with everything and to make sure that everything's being, thoroughly reviewed and vetted before it's pushed forward.
Let's talk a little bit about what's going on now in Saudi Arabia, and you have particular insight because you're very familiar with the sort of traditional um, oil-dependent states boom bust cycle. You know, where if there's a good year, all of a sudden there's bonuses given out, there's holidays awarded. You know, the government sector, public sector, you know, grows, which, as you know, is a really sticky cost. That's a problem. Um, and then when you know when an investment obviously is up, and then when you know there's a revenues are down, you know, investment is pulled back, and it's sort of a you know a completely dependent on the revenue side. And what we have talked about on the 966, something we've thought is very important, was not only the Ministry of Finance, SAMA, but in general, the budget process is much more transparent in Saudi Arabia, and that they have tried to maintain fiscal discipline, or try and stay within certain parameters in their fiscal spending, regardless of the revenue. And we talked last year about 2022 being an extraordinary moment, really, where they had this tremendous inflow of revenue, but they didn't really spend all of it. You didn't all of a sudden didn't have an expansion in government employees. We thought it was very responsible. We were very interested in what happens when the revenue contracts, which it has. And now they are deficit spending, in order to keep a lot of these projects moving and energized. Can you talk a little bit? You wrote an article, Increased Spending Raises Risks to the Saudi Budget. Can you talk a little bit about the thought process and what's going on in Saudi?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think this is an area where, the glass can be half full or half empty, right? I mean, let's start off with the half full side and say, look, there's no doubt that there has been a huge strengthening of the budget process and fiscal transparency in Saudi Arabia over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. And I think it's noticeable how we've seen very little increase in civil service employment in recent years. Now, as you said, in the past, oil booms have tended to lead to increased civil service employment, which is then very hard to reverse. Now, I think, and it's not completely clear from the data, what we have seen is probably an increase in contractual employment in Saudi as we've moved into these reforms. Contractual employment in the government sector, I should say, which is probably linked to the implementation of Vision 2030, and will clearly be easier to reverse if it needs to be than the increased employment in the past in the civil service. We've certainly seen improvements, I think, in the contracting process, in the use of, technology in the budget sector in terms of planning. We now have a, 3-year, spending window that is published. So I think all of these are, good changes. What I have to say I've been a little disappointed with recently is we have begun to see this, older pattern of spending increasing as oil revenues have increased the last year or so. So 2022 spending exceeded what was budgeted. 2023, it looks like it'll exceed again what is budgeted. And if we look at, the spending outcome projected by the Ministry of Finance in their pre-budget statement relative to the outcome in 2021, spending will be about 20% higher. Now, that's much better than it was a decade ago when oil revenues were very high, right? And we saw big increases in spending, much bigger than the 20% over 2 years. But I think it's also, it puts you in a more difficult position if oil revenues were to really go down in the future years, and then you'd be back to probably having to rein in spending. I mean, to be honest, if the deficit is 2 to 3% of GDP, I'm not worried about that. Saudi Arabia has plenty of fiscal space. It can, it can borrow. It has other ways of financing that deficit. What I would be more worried about is if, there's a much bigger decline in oil revenues and we're then looking at deficits of, 10, 15% of GDP, then I think there would have to be a reaction on the spending side, which again is then sort of getting back into the, the boom and bust on spending that we'd seen in previous cycles, which I don't think is good for, economic stability, planning for the private sector, and so on.
It seems during the pandemic, as you mentioned, two thoughts. Their debt is low, and they also seem to they have had success in going to debt markets. In other words, their issuances are oversubscribed. So I think at pretty good rates, and I think they feel very confident that they can sort of backstop, a revenue deficit with borrowing, and doing this in order to keep some of the current investments and projects, online and moving ahead. But as you say, that's not an unlimited trough. I mean, they still need to stay roughly close to their expected spending. Also, another thing that's changed over the course of your time with IMF, when you were looking closely at these numbers, is the public investment fund. You have spending now. You have significant spending that is under the auspices of the PIF, Public Investment Fund. So you have the government budget, but then you have PIF, which is making tremendously large investments and ongoing investments, which is interesting. Was that a challenge to track? What's your sense of that?
I mean, it certainly was a challenge to track when I was leading the missions to Saudi, because there was very little information available in the public domain. I think since the PIF has started issuing debt, then it has published financial statements, right? It does a more consolidated annual review as well. But even with the latest Sukuk issuance, there was a debt circular publication that's available on their website and through the London Stock Exchange, which has a lot of information in there. Now, it still doesn't have everything I think an economist would like to see. For example, it's very hard to work out what is the domestic spending the PIF is making each year. Right. There are some data published that you can make, informed inferences of that, but we don't know exactly. And I think from an economics point of view, you would like to know exactly what the PIF is spending, because I don't really think at the end of the day it's that much different to what the government itself is spending. So I think an accurate way of how public policy is affecting the economy would actually to add up the spending of the central government plus the public investment fund, maybe plus the national development fund as well. But we're not really still in a position to be able to do that. The PIF is clearly a much bigger player than it was 3, 4, 5 years ago. And with that, being able to track its activities accurately from an economic point of view is becoming, I think, increasingly important.
Yeah.
Tim, we've sort of discussed this a little, or sort of kind of moved around it a little bit, and as you've seen from your arc, working with Saudi Arabia, the break-even oil price is a sort of very easy and handy tool for outsiders looking in to sort of see how Saudi Arabia is doing in general. It's convenient to sort of say it. You wrote a piece earlier this year about why there are some pitfalls at really trying to understand the situation with just that metric. Can you sort of go through that with us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there are, to my mind, three concerns I have with the break-even oil price, and some of it is how it's often interpreted. So I think, the first is you often see in, news articles, people saying, Saudi may do this to oil production because it has a particular break-even oil price. But I think what that misses is, what matters is actually oil revenues, right, for the budget. And, if I have to cut production to achieve a certain price, well, my oil revenues are actually going to be lower than I think because, I've cut production to achieve that price. So it's almost like, the dog chasing its tail, that the more I cut production, the higher the break even oil price is, and I could ultimately keep going in this strategy of pushing the oil price up, but I still may not achieve the overall fiscal revenue target I need. The second, I think, concern is going back to the in the case of Saudi, the PIF, the calculations that are normally done by the IMF or by private sector analysts focus on the central government, and that's understandable because is again the information on the PIF, while much improved, is still hard to come up with that spending number. But in reality, the PIF is basically being financed from oil revenues as well. So what you need, if the PIF is spending, you're actually going to need a higher break-even oil price than you would calculate off of the central government budget. And then the third issue is, and this again I think touches partly on what we've already discussed, is it may not be that you actually need to balance the budget in every year. Personally, I think Saudi, can quite easily finance, relatively small fiscal surpluses, let's say 2-3% of GDP. I don't think there'll be a problem with that. So the calculation is, in a sense, based off a fiscal target, which in many cases isn't appropriate. Countries may need to run surpluses in certain circumstances, deficits in other circumstances. So, you would, I think, need to rework the calculation to actually decide what is the appropriate fiscal target for the country. And I suspect it's unlikely to be that you're going to balance the budget each year.
Tim, I guess one last question. It's kind of a big question. I think it's fascinating the categories that this census is going to focus on: population, households, housing, education, health, employment, income, migration, diversity. All these are would be of great interest to the IMF, but also I think they're of great interest to the Vision 2030 planners in Saudi Arabia. It's an opportunity to sort of take a look at where they are, what needs to be done, shortfalls, things they're accomplishing well. What's your sense? I guess it's a big question and go anywhere. What's your sense of Vision 2030?
Yeah, I mean, so I think first of all, it's really important to go back, I guess, to late 15. Well, second half of 15, early 16. And, I think if you'd asked anybody in the second half of 2015, is Saudi Arabia going to implement the scale of reforms that they have done in the last 5 and 6 years, you wouldn't have found anybody who would have expected them, right?
Not a single one.
Not a single person would have expected them. And to think, I'm going to miss, a whole range of things in, this list. But, you've had, huge increase in women participation in the labour market, women driving, the introduction of value-added tax, introduction of, tourist visas and the development of a tourism sector, energy price reforms, changes in the way the government budget is run, huge changes, the development of a debt market, IPO of Aramco, development of the domestic equity market. And, there are many, many reforms that you could go on an on listing, and without Vision 2030 being put in place and the drive of the leadership of Saudi Arabia to push those reforms, we clearly wouldn't have got to where we are from an economic perspective, today. So, I think the broad thing is, at a broad level, Vision 2030 has been a huge success in driving economic change in Saudi Arabia. Now, as you get into the specific economic statistics, it becomes, maybe there are areas where you can see success, other areas where it's harder to see. And again, the labour market is probably one area where you can obviously see success in terms of more women working, more Saudis in the private sector. The budget, you can see, much higher shares of revenue coming from non-oil sources, particularly the value-added tax. The blog I wrote on economic diversification argues you can see signs of progress on economic diversification, although oil still, I think, remains, the dominant force there. But in other areas, foreign direct investment would be an example. We haven't really seen much of an uptick there, despite the fact that, that's clearly something the authorities are very keen on driving. So I would say, from the statistical point of view, we can point to successes, and I suspect we'll see more of those going forward. But broadly, in terms of, if I take, late 15 to now, the changes you see in the economy and in Saudi society are dramatic, and dramatic, I think, in a very positive way. Maybe one last thing here as well. It's worth stepping back and saying, it's incredibly difficult diversifying an economy which is so reliant on oil. I really don't think there's a comparable example where an economy is trying to diversify when it still has, large scale oil reserves and, oil revenues available to it. So, it's clearly wishful thinking to think this can happen in a very short period of time. It's going to take years to happen. But from my personal point of view, I see things heading in a very positive direction.
Mr. Tim Callen, visiting fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, formerly IMF mission chief to Saudi Arabia, and as our listeners and viewers have heard here today, a living, breathing fountain of intelligence on the Saudi economy. Super fascinating stuff, Tim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Richard. I very much enjoyed the conversation.